I think people are still arriving, but we're going to get going, I think, because of time. Our panelists are also appearing as I am introducing. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Tim Rhodes. I'm a professor of public health sociology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm also a senior editor at the International Journal of Drug Policy. And my role today is to help moderate us, both the panelists as well as everybody out there, into an interesting discussion. I mean, the webinar, as you know, is on the topic of drugs and development and the question of whether there is and what kind of great convergence that might potentiate. The journal, the International Journal of Drug Policy, pulled together a whole bunch of material, about 22 papers in total actually, around this theme, which connects with a large project led by Professor Jonathan Goodhand at SOAS at the University of London, and involved as editors many of the panelists here, including Patrick Meehan, also at SOAS, Jasmine Batia, Mazi Ghiabi, and Francisco Gutierrez. And one of the key themes explored in this special issue is how drugs and development overlap and converge in different as well as unexpected ways. So I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of the journal, in fact, to welcome everybody to our webinar. I think the first thing I want to do is just to reiterate why the question of how drugs entangle with development is an important as well as interesting question to pursue. Now, a development-orientated approach has long been promoted as part of a policy solution, if you like, to addressing illicit drug economies in the global south, including as a way of giving focus on the various harms which might cascade from international efforts to eradicate illicit crop cultivation and drug production. A developmental approach, or a development approach, with a focus on protecting precarious livelihoods as well as promoting health through poverty alleviation and other development efforts, holds out much promise in efforts to shift global policies from or towards more rights-based, more public health, more pro-poor and peacekeeping kind of approaches. Yet, what does development mean in practice? How do policies of development entangle with drug policies, other policies, drug economies, and livelihoods locally? So these are some of the kind of more searching questions that our panelists are going to be addressing today to try and unpack, I think, some of the complexity as well as unintended consequences of well-intentioned development-orientated policies to address the problems and issues around illicit drugs. So-called alternative development initiatives, for instance, such as efforts to substitute illicit crops with licit ones, are not straightforward, as we've known for many years. Moreover, development initiatives themselves can sometimes be less part of the solution than they are part of the problem, with engagement in illicit crop cultivation and drug production, part of a very pragmatic and material response, in fact, to some of the precarities which may be generated by development initiatives themselves. So these things are not straightforward and indeed quite complex, as is the case also when illicit economies fold into situations of conflict and other forms of war, including drug wars. Now, some years ago, there was a drug policy scholar still working in this area at the University of Swansea that talked about drugs and development as the great disconnect, as things which might better connect or perhaps connect better. And we arrive today with the question of whether drugs, conflict and peace might present a great convergence. Do they? How? And what does this great convergence between drugs, development and peace mean locally in the borderlands spaces of countries in which illicit drug economies are core elements of livelihood? So these are some of the questions we're going to debate amongst us. So let me just introduce our panelists before us. Our first speaker today will be Professor Jonathan Goodhand. As I said, he's the principal investigator of the project, which is linked to much of this work. And Jonathan is a professor of conflict and development studies at the University of London, SOAS. And he's going to be tracing for us how we arrived at this key question of great convergence and what the implications might be of developmentalising drugs. After Jonathan, we're going to be joined by Francisco Gutierrez. He is a professor at the university, the National Columbia University in Bogota in Colombia. Then also by Jasmine Bhatia, who's an expert advisor on the Afghanistan peace process at the European Institute for Peace. And then lastly amongst our panelists by Patrick Meehan, who's a research fellow at SOAS working with Jonathan. Then after we've heard from our panelists, we're really pleased to have Professor Jenny Pierce, who's going to act as our discussant today. So she's going to reflect on some of the things which the panelists have talked about, and I hope kickstart for us some lively questions for debate. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, and then each of the panelists will introduce each other as we proceed through. Just a couple of more points. In the chat, I've just noticed is a link to the special issue, which, as I said, contains many more papers on this theme, which is available for free download for a promotional period. So get to it quick. The whole issue you can download for free at the moment. And the only other thing to say before Jonathan starts is to encourage you to put into the Q&A, if you can, the questions or comments or points of discussion that you would like us to focus on after the panelists have given their 10-minute and no more presentation. So don't hold back, use the Q&A, and we'll come back to everything you put in the Q&A as part of our discussion later. So thank you very much, welcome again, and Jonathan, I'm going to hand over to you now as our first panelist. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tim, and afternoon, everyone. We're really excited about this special issue as it showcases the research of the Drugs and Disorder Project. First slide. So many of you know that the project has been researching the relationship between drugs development and conflict in 9 borderland and frontier regions in Colombia, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. And we're asking ourselves an overarching question: how can war economies be transformed into peace economies in the aftermath of war? Now, our starting point for this research was to reframe illicit drugs as a development and peace building issue that needs to be firmly grounded in debates on the Sustainable Development Goals. We're an international collaboration. We have involving 12 partners, and we're aiming to produce results in 3 areas. Firstly, through research, which connects and creates new data and evidence on illicit drug economies and their relationships to development, conflict, and state fragility. Secondly, through capacity building, in order to develop our collective capacities, especially those of early career researchers, to conduct and publish high quality research on drugs issues. And thirdly, through policy engagement, so as to inform and transform policies and practices at the intersection of drugs development and peace building. Now, to turn to the special issue itself, our aim was firstly to bring together and showcase empirical research that we've been generating through our fieldwork in the 3 countries. And secondly, we're aiming to make a contribution to wider theoretical and policy debates, as Tim just introduced there, on development, drugs, and conflict. In our framing article, Critical Policy Frontiers, our starting point is to look critically at the reformist position, which recognises the harms caused by the war on drugs and advocates a developmentalist position, something we've called the Great Convergence, which integrates and aligns drug policies with development and peace building goals of the SDGs. And we see this in many respects as a positive trend. It moves us away from militarized and securitized approaches to drugs. But our research shows that the relationship between drugs and development, drugs and conflict and peace, are more complex and contextualized than this integrationist agenda allows. Behind this developmentalist agenda, there is an assumption that all good things come together, that a drugs-free world, sustainable development, and inclusive peace are mutually reinforcing and can be pursued simultaneously. But our research does not point to a smooth integration of these policy fields. When they converge in the volatile drugs-affected borderland environments where we're doing our research, as you'll see in the presentations from Francisco, Jasmine, and Pat, we see complex sets of entanglements, points of friction, counterintuitive connections, perverse outcomes, and difficult trade-offs. These can't be skirted over in the narrative of win-win outcomes. In our view, there needs to be a more honest, evidence-based, contextualized, and politically informed discussion of the encounters, tensions, and trade-offs between drugs development and peace building. So in our framing article, we make a set of arguments critically looking at this integrationist agenda and presenting an alternative framework. There isn't time to elaborate on that now, so I'm going to zoom in on the notion of the policy trilemma that we put forward at the end of the paper. So this builds upon the work of development economist Danny Roderick and his idea of a policy trilemma in the context of international development. And he challenged very prominent policy narrative that all good things come together, that countries, late developing countries, simply need to choose the right policies irrespective of context. Roderick argues that it's not possible for developing countries to simultaneously pursue economic integration, national sovereignty, and democratization. Countries can work towards two of these conditions, but not all three at any one time. So the trilemma highlights the trade-offs involved in making policy choices and the need to take context seriously. We think there's a similar trilemma in relation to the policy fields of drugs development and peace building. And the integrationist agenda, the great convergence, skirts over the tensions and trade-offs between these policy fields and what happens when they become entangled in borderland spaces. It's also, we believe, based on a very limited understanding of development as a planned project, as something that could be engineered, for example, through boutique alternative development programs. And it's blind to or silent about the actually existing process of development as a process of historical change, which produces winners and losers rather than win-win situations, and involves processes of struggle that are often violent and protracted. And as we'll see in a minute, these processes of development may be deeply connected to borderland illicit economies. So at the core of our argument is a contention that the policy goals of a drug-free world, inclusive development, and peace building can't be pursued simultaneously and in their ideal type form. To finish off, just to give you three quick examples to elaborate on the trilemma and taking these three axes of A, B, and C. So if we take A, efforts to tackle drugs and development may undermine elite interests and create new conflicts and undermine peace building efforts. Our research has shown there's no fixed one-directional relationship between drugs, conflict, and peace. The rents generated, for example, by the drug economy in the borderlands of Nimrose that Jasmine will talk about in a minute, may be central to the political coalitions that create a modicum of order. Attempts to tackle drugs and to formalize trade through interdiction or the hardening and securitization of borders have been deeply destabilizing and led to an uptick in violence. Moving on to B, efforts to tackle drugs and peace building may undermine the livelihoods and trading networks and investment capital that has sustained development processes. So in Colombia, as Francisco will talk about, the cocoa economy is central to people's livelihoods in frontier regions, and in many ways is the alternative development. Fumigation and eradication efforts without alternative investments in infrastructure, social welfare, and development programs have had a devastating effect on livelihoods and safety nets. And finally, C, efforts to tackle development and peace building cannot also tackle drug economies, which are central to local livelihoods and political settlements. If we zoom in to Myanmar, and Pat's going to be talking about, ending violence may involve unsavory deals with political elites. So bargains between the state and militias in Myanmar over the control of revenues generated by the drug economy were central to the stabilization and pacification of borderland regions. And this, of course, leads to difficult questions about what kind of peace can be built in drugs-affected borderlands, and the tensions between the peace built through elite bargaining processes, which may lead to forms of elite capture, as opposed to more progressive and developmental and inclusive forms of peace. So what our trilemma is showing, aims to explore, is that there's no simplistic, fixed, and one-directional relationship between drugs and development, drugs and peace building. And perhaps counterintuitively, one can see at least examples of cases where drug economies may play a role in furthering SDG goals in relation to safety nets, social advancement, and stability. And conversely, illicit economies, attempts to address illicit economies may work in the opposite direction. Of course, there's a lot more complexity in this trilemma that I've been able to present now. There are trade-offs within each of these 3 points of the diagram. So in relation to harder eradication and interdiction efforts versus softer harm reduction and alternative developments, in relation to growth-oriented versus equity-oriented approaches to development, and between approaches which focus on stabilization versus those which have a more inclusive and transformative focus on peace building. So finally, our analysis of the trilemma also highlights the need for policymakers to turn the mirror inwards, that rather than seeing themselves as neutral players seeking to make optimal policy choices, they are active players embedded within and contributing to the dynamics of drug-affected borderlands. So our article aims to unpack the political economy of policymaking, revealing how policy choices may often have very little to do with the ostensible goals of a drug-free world, development, or peace building. So to conclude, in putting forward this trilemma, we see it as a useful heuristic device to unpack and analyze trade-offs with a view to developing policies that can support more sustainable water-peace transitions in drugs-affected borderlands. The contributions of our special issues show in a very compelling and concrete way the trade-offs, the distribution effects of drugs development and peace-building policies, with a focus on the lived experience and life rules of those living in the borderlands, whose lives often depend upon or are defined by illicit economies and efforts to combat them. I'll now hand over to Francisco to zoom in to the papers on Colombia.
Thanks, Jonathan. I am looking for my presentation. Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Francisco.
Perfect, thank you. So I will speak about the tough trade-offs faced by alternative development in Colombia, but I will present a slightly different version from that I did in the article, making a little bit more emphasis on policy. So in 2016, the Colombian government and the FARC signed a peace agreement, which had a very important point, a focal point on drug substitution. And in the slide, you see the theory of change presented by the UNODC related to this point. So basically the steps were in month 1, you speak with the community. In month 2, you start to deliver the goods, then you push forward the substitution programs. In month 7 and 8, you start to have the legal crops, and then you arrive to this shiny, heartwarming sun of sustainable legal development. And this theory of change you can find easily not only in policy papers, but in academic papers as well, and it reflects very much the framework according to which all good things come together. But this framework is based in a lot of untenable assumptions. First of all, that coca has been wholly destructive for communities. In fact, it has been a very powerful tool for the social advancement and the access to some fundamental resources for peasants, and the existence of the previous existence of tight-knit communities many a times is a kind of academic fantasy. It has been an unending source of violence. Here there are a lot of problems. Actually, quantitatively, it is not so easy to demonstrate it has been a source of deep demoralization, which actually coincides with the vision of many social leaders. But there's another aspect of this. First of all, the coca growing regions are not frozen in a kind of a permanent state of immorality and instability. People learn, there has been a lot of social change. And what we have demonstrated, you can see here in the figure at the left of the screen, that this figure is taken from a survey that we did in Tumaco and Puerto Asís in 2019, which we actually repeated in this year. And it shows that the majority of people of coca growers were investing mainly in land, education, especially education and fixed assets. And they had a completely different framework from what this assumption would like to think was the predominant framework. And that legal development instead is moral and good. Actually, legal agrarian development in Colombia has been extraordinarily violent, and through violence, it has concentrated land in a few hands. And besides agrarian frontiers, not only in Colombia, but in Latin America, this has been described by many authors, among them Eric Hobsbawm, has been also marked by illegality and violence and instability. So what is lacking in this rhetoric of all good things come together, and this version of a path towards the shining sun of legal agrarian development, is a comparison between legal and illegal sectors. And what we have found systematically, I think we already have very, very strong evidence, both quantitative and qualitative, is that in coca agrarian frontiers, the structure of land tenancy is relatively egalitarian. There is overwhelming predominance of small peasants, small tenants. Coca economy is very labor intensive, among other things, because due to its illegal status, but also because the key activity is to collect the leaf, and this cannot be easily mechanized. Then you have to resort to contracted labor. A lot of these workers finally have access to land, and of course they have this hazy, fundamental illegal access to global markets. And this has allowed for the advancement of specific social sectors, for example, labor, small peasants, etc. So this makes a huge contrast with the Colombian legal sector, and allows, using the terminology of Bernstein, different peasant sectors to escape the reproductive squeeze. Now, I don't want to say that the coca sector is a kind of paradise or an egalitarian phalanstery. It is not. There are some dynamics of polarization, certainly a lot of violence, a lot of instability. But if you compare with the legal agrarian sector, you will find that it has its own horrors, but at the same time, it has distinct advantages. And this expresses itself in the livelihoods of people, in the lived experience of people, in a kind of trade-off between profitability and precarity. So kind of trade-off between social inclusion through coca, which at the same time produces territorial exclusion. And then many of the demands coming from these sectors are territorially based demands. In this figure, you can see the access of peasants and growers, coca peasants and growers, to public works, and you can see that they only have electricity. And then speaking with the peasants, they told you, yes, we have electricity, but this is electricity provided by us, both privately and with these small plants that provide electricity, and the rest only 2, 3, 4% had access to sewerage, drinking water, aqueduct, natural gas, etc., natural gas, etc., etc. So in these conditions, it is difficult to imagine how some kind of legal crop could prosper. And this poses some difficult questions to alternative development beyond this kind of Disney sociology that feeds the notion that all good things come together. So first of all, of course, the sustainability of the crop, because in legal crops, global prices come and go. And besides, there are vicious circles in the sense that when you have a lot of substitution, then the prices of the coca, or simply massive eradication, the prices of the coca go up, and then you have even better incentives to cultivate it. Second of all, which are the consequences in the specific territories of a large scale change in the use of soil, for example, in terms of the transformation of the productive structure, the concentration of land, etc., etc. So in regions like Catatumbo, in regions like where we have had real existing alternative development, we can also see associated process of severe associated processes of land concentration, changes in land tenancy and class structure, the possibility of peasants peasants and labor, which is more or less common sense today in coca growing agrarian frontiers. Will they have stable access to land in the new scenario? Changes, of course, in labor markets, the real existing alternatives of the legal sector now are palm oil or oil or extensive cattle ranching, which are lousy employers. And of course, changes in the menu of winners and losers. But there are also two issues related not only to the conditions of desirability, but also to the conditions of possibility. One is the quality of alternative development. Very surprisingly, despite all the enthusiasm invested in it, and of course also the money and the human capacities invested in it, in Colombia, we haven't had a single case of evaluation of alternative development programs. So this puts a question mark on its quality, of course. I'm sure that members of my team will say, no, you are wrong. There is a case in 1997, in May 1997, which was evaluated. And we'll have to say, yes, you're right. But the general situation is simply a non-evaluation of the policy. So we really don't know what effect do they have. And there is the notion that this program of taking the state to the agrarian frontier is the core, the tool, the core mechanism of alternative development. But this program has been out there for 50, 60 years, has been repeated and pushed forward by a huge quantity of actors, the United States, Colombian military, Colombian civilians, actually also the police. And a lot of these leaders have said, we have to do this, but it hasn't happened. And there are not very good answers to the question of why hasn't the state been taken to the agrarian frontier. This is a huge issue. So concluding, there are yet tough trade-offs for peasants in the sense that they face violence, risk, illegality due to coca. Living with illegality is horrible, and social leaders and peasants know it very well. but look at this quote that I plugged into the article. There are many others. Without coca, we would not have this horror. He was referring to the horrors of the present situation in the moment we interviewed this person. But we would not have clothes, medicines, foods, or other necessities either. So this is a very poignantly lived trade-off. Also, the trade-off between inclusion and territorial neglect. There are a lot of things to be said about this, but the life at the coca-growing agrarian frontier is constituted by these tensions. There are, of course, counter-arguments. I think the most serious one is, okay, the coca economy is not egalitarian. These peasants only get the crumbles of the global market. This is completely true, but and it's very relevant for other contexts. But in the context of this discussion, it's frankly doesn't matter very much because people, human beings, also economic agents, build their choices and their vital paths through the options they have in reality. And thus, what peasants do is compare their options in relation to the legal and illegal economies that coexist in the countries. Not about an ideal distribution of the goods produced by the global markets. So what the Colombian ID disregards is the comparison of these different paths of agrarian development, the huge distributional issues involved in the operations of changing the use of the soil and also the political economy of this territorial change. Now, ending, I am convinced, and much more importantly than this, social leaders and organized peasants are convinced that there has to be a transition from the illegal to the legal economies, because among many other things, living in illegality is quite horrible and quite harrowing. But so they are dead set on pushing forward this transition if it only were possible. But to make it feasible, we also have to make a cognitive transition with a much better and much more serious sociology of what does it mean to transit from these economies to legal economies, and how to protect the most vulnerable sectors in that transition. So this is all, and I hand it to Yasmin. So.
Great.
I think I already, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francisco. So I think, Louise, you've got the slides. Perfect. Great. So I'm going to be presenting our field work and that we wrote up for the IJDP as part of the Afghanistan team at Drugs and Disorder. So at the moment, I'm an advisor at the European Institute of Peace, but prior to that, I was part of the Drugs and Disorder team in SOAS and working on the Afghanistan team. So just to go over our core argument. So the Afghanistan team's work to date has really been focused on the key issues we've already been talking about. So the dynamics of drugs, conflict, and development in borderland provinces of Afghanistan. So as many of you know, the conflict in Afghanistan has intensified considerably over the past few years. And it's quite common in policy circles to attribute some of this intensification to the drug economy, which is typically seen as a key driver of conflict. And so this is owing to the fact that the Taliban and other armed groups in the country profit or are quite involved in the drug economy, and then use those profits and rents to continue the fighting, to pay salaries for soldiers, for weapons, and things like that. So this is a very common assumption. And a follow-on assumption is that you need to bring the economy, the drug economy, under control in order to achieve peace and stability. However, the research we've done demonstrates a more complicated relationship between drugs and conflict. So next slide. We conducted our research primarily in the borderland provinces of Nangarhar and Nimrose between 2018 and 2020, looking at both licit and illicit trade flows, and also looking at both formal and informal border crossings. And so on the map, you can see there are two formal border crossings, Zaranj in Nimrose, which is on the left side, and Torkham in Nangarhar, which is on the right, as well as a number of informal crossings in both provinces. So next slide. So here's a photo from one of these informal border crossings in Nangarhar that our field teams visited. And so as you can see, there's not a lot of, at the stage where we did our research, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure. It's pretty much an open border. And so what we tried to do is place the drug economy in its wider political and economic context. And we explored a number of questions. So first, is it actually true that the drug economy is especially violent or destabilizing? And secondly, do counter-narcotics measures to curb the drug economy lead to more stable outcomes? What are the impacts on people's livelihoods and development? So why Nangarhar and Nimrose? So they're both borderland regions that are deeply interconnected with neighboring provinces. So the drug economy is important, but they're also cross-border hubs of many different types of goods. In both provinces, there is a presence, quite a persistent presence of armed insurgent groups. So that issue is quite important. And finally, the Afghan state historically exerted little direct control, specifically over the border and borderlands. And so for centuries, people generally moved quite freely across the border, and in many cases, developed close ties between communities across the border. And so this has actually changed in the last decade to some extent, primarily through unilateral actions by Iran and Pakistan to police the border more forcefully. So on the next slide, just to show an example of this, so here is the Nangarhar border with Pakistan, and this is a map of the major trading routes in Nangarhar. So along the border, you can see there's like a pink line, which is where a border fence has been installed by Pakistan over the last few years. And so this happened over the course of our fieldwork. And we explored the impact of these changes on the local political economy. So in terms of findings, what we found was the relationship between drugs development and violence is of course more complicated than it usually is presumed to be. So one, it isn't necessarily the case that the drug economy was an exceptional driver of conflict. So in Nangarhar, for example, the Islamic State and Taliban both controlled quite a bit of territory at the time of fieldwork. But unlike the Taliban, the Islamic State has engaged in quite forceful drug eradication measures in the territories it controls, and these are primarily for ideological reasons. So instead, they're quite a bit more dependent on taxing other goods such as timber and talc, and as well as relying on extortion and violence to generate rents. In Nimrose, what we observed also is that other economic activities such as fuel and people smuggling were sometimes even more important than the drug economy for various non-state actors. So we didn't find that the drug economy was particularly exceptional in this regard in comparison to other goods. Secondly, we looked at the impact of counter-narcotic measures to control the border. And what we found both in Nangarhar and Nimrose was that these measures disrupted traditional cross-border economies quite considerably. So in Nimrose and in Nangarhar, attempts to regulate the drug economy through enhanced border controls crowded out a long-standing cross-border survival economy, which pushed communities dependent on trade into greater economic precarity. At the same time, political elites with strong connections were able to circumvent border restrictions. So we saw a lot of cases of corruption at the border where elites were able to bribe border officials and able to even rent border crossings for a night to smuggle drugs. So there are a lot of cases like that. In Zaranj, the capital of Nimrose, it effectively became an economic boomtown, which brought a lot of greater infrastructure, inward migration, and economic opportunities. But these opportunities were not experienced the same for different groups. So in particular, we saw a lot of forest land acquisitions, which angered a lot of the local population. Ironically, we found that the disruption to a lot of cross-border livelihoods, more people, particularly young people, became dependent on the drug economy to survive. While this effect was less extreme in Nangarhar, we did observe that in both cases, illicit cross-border flows became more professional and vertical. So small traders are effectively crowded out. Small traders also were sometimes forced to take greater physical and financial risks in order to continue their work, sometimes exposing themselves to violence and extortion. Importantly, one thing these measures did not do is reduce the amount of violence in either province. So at present, levels of violence are high in both provinces, and government control is quite fragile outside of major population centers. So I'll conclude there with a number of implications. So just to reiterate, our findings show that the drug trade is not exceptionally violent or disruptive. It's instead part of a wider commodity network embedded in a complex and sometimes violent political economy dominated by local entrepreneurs and their networks. Secondly, the drug economy can have a stabilizing effect in certain circumstances. In both cases, cross-border communities traditionally dependent on the drug trade became more destabilized and economically precarious after the implementation of counter-narcotics measures. So the drug economy did not disappear, but became more professional and less redistributive. And typically what we observed is that small traders were often the ones who lost out the most. So just tying this back to the drug conflict, peace building and development trilemma described by Jonathan at the beginning, policymakers really need to think in terms of trade-offs. So the kinds of interventions, unilateral inventions implemented by Pakistan, by Iran, without any kind of compensating measures for local communities can be both economically devastating and locally destabilizing. And this can ultimately have the long-term effect of undermining the legitimacy of public authorities and ultimately risking future conflicts. So I'll stop there. We can discuss more in the Q&A, and I will hand over to Patrick to talk about Myanmar.
Hi, everyone. I think Louise is just going to set up the slides and then we'll get going. Okay, hi everyone. So our work in Myanmar as part of the GCRF project focuses on drug issues across Kachin State and Shan State. These are regions of both large-scale illegal drug production of opium, heroin, and methamphetamines, and also of rising drug use. In the short time that I have in today's talk, I want to offer some brief reflections on how both drug production and rising drug use have become embedded in wider development processes that have shaped Myanmar's borderlands. In terms of drug production, the research I present in the IJDP special issue was motivated to address what I saw as a significant blind spot in narratives surrounding the relationship between poverty, rural development, and opium cultivation. The paper argues that the current agenda that Jonathan alluded to integrate drugs and development policy must confront the fact that for many households, the decision to cultivate opium has been a response to the very processes of market-led rural development that policymakers often claim will alleviate poverty. This means that there's a need to address the fact that people who cultivate drugs because they are poor are not just those who've been left behind by development, but are also those who've experienced new forms of poverty as a consequence of processes of economic liberalization, market integration, and the commercialization of smallholder agriculture. My work explores this blind spot by focusing on a region of southwestern Shan State, where poppy cultivation expanded significantly since the late 1990s. And it's an area where I've been doing field research for the past decade. The expansion of opium production in this region was overlooked initially, and this was because total levels of opium production fell in Shan State through the late 1990s and 2000s. And this was due to a series of opium bans that were imposed by armed groups in eastern Shan State. These bans were implemented by armed groups in an attempt to gain international recognition and remove themselves from US sanction lists. and also as they became less dependent on opium revenues, not least because they increasingly began to produce synthetic drugs. However, these bans created a balloon effect that started to motivate opium cultivation in other areas of Shan State. The rise in opium cultivation in southwestern Shan State was particularly notable for a number of reasons. Firstly, this was a region where there wasn't a long history of large-scale opium cultivation. Yet by the mid-2000s, it had become one of the densest areas of opium cultivation in Myanmar. Secondly, rising opium production coincided with the decline in levels of armed conflict across a number of townships and the increasing integration of this region's agricultural sector into national and global markets. Thirdly, the declining levels of armed conflict and the region's fertile farmland meant that parts of southwestern Shan State were particularly affected by wider changes in Myanmar's agricultural sector. This included the relaxation on international trade restrictions, business-friendly reforms to land laws and foreign investment laws, efforts to promote agribusiness investment, and attempts to integrate smallholders into competitive value chains. And it was also notable because in many of the interviews conducted with farmers in this region, their primary concerns and the reasons they gave for taking up poppy cultivation were rooted in the increasing difficulties of making a living in a changing rural economy in which they felt that the odds were stacked against them, rather than due to longer standing issues of armed conflict. So how did these wider processes of borderland development and agrarian change create new pathways into drug cultivation? Firstly, many farmers faced a situation where economic liberalization, expanding international trade, and market integration actually led to a fall in prices for traditional cash crops. In southwestern Shan State, this was most pronounced in upland areas that had traditionally produced thanat pet leaves, which are used to roll cheroots, which were the local form of cigarettes, I guess, and tea. Whereas the liberalization and the opening up of border trade led to a big expansion in imports of cheap cigarettes and imports of tea, especially from China. And prices for traditional cash crops in this region plummeted. Efforts to shift to produce alternative forms of cash crops proved very challenging for smallholders. Many cash crops trialed, such as coffee and fruit trees, take years to mature and require significant upfront investment that many smallholders simply couldn't manage. Production of quicker harvesting crops, such as maize, expanded in Shan State, and yet maize, like many other crops, had significant upfront costs and economies of scale. Yields are much higher where farmers can invest in irrigation and where large amounts of fertilizers and pesticides are used to offset soil exhaustion. Yet it was agribusinesses and better off farmers that were able to capitalize on these economies of scale. In contrast, poorer smallholders found themselves increasingly exposed. For example, many were reliant on borrowing money to purchase seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. Formal credit was almost entirely absent, and moneylenders charged up to 5 to 10% interest per month. And this made smallholders very vulnerable to commodity price volatilities. And despite promises that embracing market change would make them rich, the reality for many poorer smallholders has been increasing cycles of debt, distress, sales of assets, and further impoverishment. It was also clear that there was a lack of off-farm opportunities, that currently in Myanmar, more than 50% of the population derive their livelihoods from farming. A number of government and donor policy documents acknowledge that strategies to modernize Myanmar's agricultural sector will inevitably require a smaller proportion of the population to be involved in agriculture. However, the assumptions that new opportunities in the non-farming sector will create viable exit options for those that are no longer able to make a living in agriculture is very problematic. It is land and resources rather than labor that has been highly coveted by investors. And it's also highly questionable that sufficient jobs will be created in an industrial sector to create new opportunities for those that are made surplus in the agricultural sector. And so it's against this backdrop of increasing market-induced precarity that the shift to opium cultivation across upland areas of Shan State needs to be understood. Opium helped to protect smallholders. Partly this is because of opium's status as illegal, that to a significant extent, it inhibited the concentration of the means of opium production. Smallholders remain important to how the opium economy works, largely because of the role they play in shouldering the risks of eradication and punishment. Furthermore, in contrast to other cash crops whose prices fell or were prone to significant volatility, opium prices have remained relatively stable, especially in light of rising heroin demand in China and declining levels of opium production in Laos, Thailand, and Eastern Shan State. So this effectively gave farmers in southwestern Shan State a comparative advantage in opium production that they did not have in other crops. Similar to what Francisco was saying, at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that the opium economy is no panacea for farmers, that it also locked them into social relations that often exploited them. They were reliant upon money lenders who charged high interest and often compelled farmers to sell their harvest to them at prices that were set by the moneylender. So the opium economy paradoxically has both provided protection and intensified exploitation of smallholders. There are a number of implications for this work. I think the first one of these is that it provides a stark warning of the risks now facing some of the most vulnerable populations in Shan State if the shifting market demand across Asia for synthetic drugs causes a permanent downward trend in opium prices. That this is something that's been seen over the last couple of years, where there's been increasing demands for methamphetamines and falling prices for opium. Some policymakers have suggested that falling opium prices will create opportunities to entice farmers to switch to legal crops. However, I think this ignores the fact that opium has already been the alternative livelihood for those who faced increasing poverty within the legal agricultural sector. So far from providing opportunities, falling prices represent the slashing of the key safety net that many farming households have been reliant upon. In terms of wider policy debates, this research argues that if current efforts to integrate drugs in development are to be effective, they have to confront the chronic poverty and precarity that is embedded within market-led development. So rising opium production in this region of southwestern Shan State is not simply a story of marginalised rural communities left behind by development. It also reveals many smallholders' unhappy encounter with development processes, in which opium became the exit option from illicit agricultural sector, in which the odds were stacked against them. In the final couple of minutes that I have, I also just want to touch upon the other papers in the special issue on Myanmar that focus more on issues around rising drug use and responses to this. So the special issue includes a set of 3 papers that were led by Mandi Sadan and a team of researchers at the Kachinland Research Centre that focus on the worsening impact of drug harms in northern Myanmar and the subsequent rise of a local anti-drug social movement known as Pat Jasan. There's no time in this presentation to do justice to the depth of analysis in these papers. However, I just want to outline a couple of entry points into this body of work and how this relates to the broader theme in the talk that I've given today about the relationship between drugs and development. One of the key points in these papers reveals how worsening levels of drug harms became tied to processes of borderland development during a period of reduced armed conflict following the 1994 ceasefire between the Myanmar army and the region's largest armed group, the KIA, or the Kachin Independence Army. In contrast to hopes that the ceasefire would lead to increased prosperity, the following 17 years of armed peace did not produce a dividend of social and economic improvements for the majority of the population. Instead, development processes in the Kachin region were defined largely by the vast expansion in resource extraction, especially mining and logging, and large-scale infrastructure projects such as road building and dams, while investment in welfare and social services were almost non-existent. Mining and logging areas became key sites of rising drug use, and that these problems around mining stretched deeply into Kachin society, as almost every Kachin household's livelihood is connected in one way or another with somebody working in the mining areas. Even the positive development gains under the ceasefire became coloured by a collective perception of the slow violence of widespread drug use that accompanied them. For example, reduced conflict, improvements in rural roads, the wider availability of motorbikes and mobile phones improved connectivity for everyone, including young people, who could travel further and had greater independence. However, this enhanced mobility and autonomy also made it easier for young people to congregate and created new forms of social interactions that diminished familial oversight and control. It also made it much easier for drugs to travel to new rural markets beyond major towns. A second example relates to education, which has long been a primary route out of poverty and an aspiration as part of wider Kachin ethno-nationalism. Many families made extensive sacrifices to enable their children to go to high school or even to progress to university. But in many cases, schools and universities became key sites of drug use. In this context, a local church-based anti-drugs movement known as Patchasan emerged in response to what was perceived as an existential crisis of rising drug-related harms. Patchasan was in many respects part of a redemptive narrative in which some people sought to take back control by mobilizing against the drugs crisis. Patchasan has created significant controversy in light of its responses to drug issues, which has included punishment, forced drug withdrawal, and a rejection of harm reduction models of best practice. However, what the papers tried to do is to emphasize the need to put the rise of Patchasan in its wider social, historical, political, and economic context. They also emphasized that what is lost in the tensions and competing narratives between local community mobilization and harm reduction programs is how to improve responses to drug harms and how to reduce adverse impacts of drug use in context of very scant resources. Indeed, in emphasizing the obvious need for harm reduction programs, there's often a tension in that organizations perhaps imply that they have the capacity to provide solutions that their resources also do not in reality provide. Few external organizations have been able to operate other than in a very limited way in the Kachin region. So the challenge ahead, and what the papers try to focus on, is how to bridge this disconnect that currently exists between externally driven and local conceptions of drug issues, and how bridging this disconnect may be able to support better informed, more effective and collectively owned approaches for addressing drug-related harms. In particular, they emphasize the need of how to harness the obvious benefits that can accrue from harm reduction programs for individuals, as well as how to address the needs and concerns of households and communities who will undoubtedly have to provide additional resources beyond the limited resources that clinics will be able to provide in terms of treatment and rehabilitation, and also to provide the emotional and material support to sustain longer term forms of responses to drugs. And I'll finish there. And I think I'm passing over to Tim. Sorry, Tim.
I think we've lost him, actually. I can't see him here. So perhaps we can go straight to Jenny Pierce, who is our discussant. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you very much. Well, very rich set of papers and very hard to do justice to in 10 minutes, but I want to put forward a few general comments and 4 more focused ones and a conclusion. I mean, I think overall, what these papers do is to offer a very serious challenge to the logics behind drugs policy formation. and the assumptions behind what, you know, I for one thought was actually, you know, a generally progressive set of sustainable development goals. But, you know, clearly drugs policy can actually contribute to some of those and actually undermine them as well, because drugs actually does give some benefits in terms of income and access to education to peasant farmers. It also asks us to question how policymakers know about the area of drugs cultivation and all the associated activities in the borderlands of the 3 countries of the study. So they, in a sense, ask, how is knowledge about drugs cultivation in these regions constructed, and what are the outcomes of that? It's an epistemological challenge, I think, to the baked-in knowledge that policy actors and political actors have around this topic, or what generate convenient political messages, such as that of Colombian President Duque, who gave a tweet in September 2020, where there is more coca, there is less peace. And of course, there is a lot of violence outside coca growing areas, and you could not reduce the violence in Colombia to the coca growing areas. So they bring to focus borderland areas where fieldwork is very difficult, to unpack not just the damage of war on drugs per se, which has been amply discussed, but rather the positive incentive structures and benefits that come from growing coca and opium, and how a certain kind of development, market-led development, has led poor farmers to drugs cultivation rather than away from it. And in fact, alternative, as it's known, development does not transform the broad general understanding of development as a whole that often undermines the capacity of people living in very difficult contexts. So these benefits that people have in these areas are in tension with multiple insecurities that comes as well from drugs cultivation. And they go from agricultural modernization itself, land tenure impacts in Shan province, Myanmar, growing local drug consumption in that area, which, you know, I thought was in Colombia, for instance, is a lot I've watched as drugs consumption has grown in the urban areas, but I don't know that it's such an issue in the rural ones. Changes in frontier policies from Iran and Pakistan, the Afghanistan border, with impacts on livelihoods, along with the presence of the Taliban and all local power brokers, and the ongoing violences and competition of criminal trafficking organizations in Colombia, as well as the dissident and insurgent groups have continued the armed struggle after the peace process. So there are lots of insecurities as well as these benefits that have been highlighted. And these contexts make it clear, however, that many drugs cultivators would accept alternatives, but ones that guarantee a sustained, secure and dignified livelihood. That's an important message from research, I think, because we need to be thinking, well, what exactly do they consist of and how can they be implemented in the present international context? And also when, you know, market-led development remains the paradigm. So it's interesting that this research project began in the context of there was a possibility for peace in these areas. In all 3 countries, the shadow of war in various guises remains, while drugs production increases. So what I took from the papers and implications is that while the drugs issue itself is immensely complex, we all know that, the public policy field and the political field find it hard to change gear for various reasons, one of which is the policy trilemma that Jonathan and the team have referred to, but they seem unable to reset the conversation. So my question really is, what would enable us to reset the question? I found the arguments very convincing that I have been involved in the project quite a bit, but I've certainly learned a lot. But I'm worried that the international system appears to have less and less clout in actually engaging in this topic, but also rethinking the conversation. And just as I say that, I'm thinking of another part of the value chain of drug production, and I'm thinking of just what's happened recently of Duterte, who's actually killed criminal actors, but particularly drug addicts, some 12,000 since 2016, mostly urban poor. and he just refused for a request from the ICC prosecutor before he retires to investigate. And then in Mexico, which is part of the OECD, there were 89 politicians killed and 782 crimes against candidates between September 2020, when the campaign began, and May 2021. A great deal of this connected to efforts by drugs traffickers to ensure control over local municipalities. So the rise of these groups is a legacy on the war on drugs, but I just wanted to raise those two issues from the other side of the drugs value chain, because I wanted to remind us of the urgency of this resetting of the conversation. So with that in mind, let me turn to the first sort of point of the 4 points I want to make. I wanted to draw out some of the points that seem to be in common to all the cases. And so what do they tell us really that we need to think about in that resetting of the conversation about drugs? So first of all, I think this issue of the benefits of coca and opium growing is such a strong message from this, that it cannot be seen that this isn't something that people have actually gained from in some way. We know that there are also lots of problems with it, but let me just say the gains. Myanmar, the opium growing has been a defense against the developmentalist agribusiness driven approach of China after 2010. Colombia, Alfredo Molano, famous historian of the peasant colonizers into what became the cocoa growing areas, coca prevented the decomposition of the peasant economy. And more than this, as Francisco has so well pointed out, coca has contributed to social mobility of a kind and possibilities to access to education and to women's employment. In Afghanistan, opium growing is part of a frontier economy which has enabled families to survive long decades of war, deal with the Taliban and other power brokers, and to have some kind of economic agency, perhaps. In all the cases, what I think crosses them is that issues of land tenure and inequality of assets emerges as absolutely crucial, and also challenges the development models that do not engage with that particular issue. Another point in common, I think, is that these benefits go along with these insecurities and also violence. I always argue that violence, not war, is the opposite of peace. And that I think to some extent what we see in these areas, because I take Jasmine's point that, is there anything particular about coca growing areas that are more violent than other areas? And I think there are different perhaps issues across the cases on that. But I think in some places we see a kind of violence ordering and containment due to some often pacts with armed actors. They temporarily halt some of its expressions. Homicides are a necessary, but I would argue insufficient measure of the violence that's happening in these areas. But we must never forget, I think, that unregulated economies of accumulation ultimately rely to some extent on violence as a regulatory mechanism, and this violence reproduces through the spaces of socialization. So women in Colombia gain working opportunities in coca growing farms, but remain vulnerable to violence of different kinds, especially as the more money circulates, etc. So we have some dilemmas here. We have on the one hand benefits, on the one hand the problems, and Francisco and others have talked about this very well, these trade-offs. So I think an important issue that comes out of all the cases is to put violence, not just homicides, and not just war-related violences, but non-war violences, into the political economy approach that is part of the approach that emerges from the cases. So violence is a development issue. It will accompany the drugs chain at all levels, from cultivation to trafficking to consumption. Pacts might reduce homicides in certain periods, but actually we mustn't forget that violence remains a major issue. A couple of points of variation in the cases. I was kind of quite interested in the varied impacts that coca and opium have on political processes across the three case studies. This is very clear in the Colombia case, with coca growers being forced in a way between the state and the armed groups in order to make a living. On the Afghan border, local political leaders give permits to grow coca. I imagine there are threats behind that. Myanmar, there are negotiations between the militia and the army. So there are all sorts of political impacts that I think have to be taken into account, not just because they happen in the local areas, but how they impact on the nation, the state, and what kind of politics emerges from this. That these borderlands also impact on regional and national political dynamics. That there is a certain benefit to poor farmers, right? But money and power accumulate. And I think Francisco made the point that everyone recognizes that this end of the value chain is the least benefited economically by the product that is grown. But this impact that has further on, not because it's grown in the cocoa lands, but because of the capital accumulation process, because of the way capital is extracted. And I don't think we should ever forget that. In Colombia, I remember when the traffickers began buying land in Colombia in the 1980s, land is subject to very low taxes. As traffickers began to buy up land, they also eventually went into paramilitarism, no time to go into all this discussion. But economic and political power has been greatly impacted by the processes of accumulation. And because of that, the transformatory agendas like land reform becomes more and more difficult. Peasant farmers have less and less choice, and powerful actors step in to the policy offer to address these deep structural issues, or rather not to address them, but to offer, you know, alternative development in the end, but something we know doesn't address these underlying deep issues. So another issue that I thought came out across as a point of variation to some extent is the relationship of all the borderlands with the value chain of drugs as a whole, and it links to the last point in a sense. So that there seem to be some differences between Colombia, where some cocoa growers do process, but they grow, but they do process, but do not traffic. And as far as we know, there's less consumption in the rural areas. I might be wrong there, but we now know this is different in Myanmar. And we also know that from what Jasmine has said, in the Afghan border area, small traders lose out to others. So there are processes going on in these borderland areas, which are developing new stratifications, perhaps, and which gives some access, greater access to the value chain than others. Clearly, organized trafficking is very different to individual trafficking, but I was quite interested about the fact that in all the cases, there were slightly different roles going on in terms of the capacity to enter the value chain. And then just a conclusion, right? Okay, right? Those are just kind of particular points that just came to me as I read the papers. But I suppose we're all interested in, okay, so what do we do? Right, what is the way forward then, having learned actually focusing on the areas of cultivation is not going to be the solution? Well, that's been said for a long time, but actually we now have the detail. We now understand why it's not the solution. We now understand why the solutions that focus on it actually are counterproductive or don't really deal with what needs to be dealt with, and actually halt the political solution of real problem to drug trafficking in the future. So I suppose I didn't end the papers with a great deal of optimism, but I thought it is amazing to launch this debate. We have to have this debate, and now we have this detail. It actually is a moment, I think, to pause and actually really have it in depth. I felt that, as I said before, I think that the international moment is not great for the resetting of the conversation. But I think we need to sort of start addressing where the great powers, so to speak, come in to the problem we're addressing. You know, it is the US has played a great role in getting the Colombian government, for instance, to engage in fumigation, into focusing on the areas of cultivation, right? So what room for maneuver is there at that level of the US? And now China steps in, and we see the role they're playing in Myanmar. And I think we need to understand better what China's attitude is towards the cocoa growing and opium growing areas. There are clearly, when we focus on the cocoa and opium growing areas, we have to think land rights, dignified livelihoods, protection and security. At that end of the chain, those are actually vital. But for me, the capital accumulation process attached to the entire value chain is at the heart. And the fact that rather than the rule of law, regulation by violence is what characterizes the drugs industry. And that value chain has very big impacts across the globe, including in the UK, where increasingly we're hearing about the county lines and about the impact on urban poor young men in this country. So resetting the conversation, it seems to me, begins with the transformation in what we think we know. And that's what this journal has offered us, to give us the chance to transform why we think we know what we know. To recognize that I think the arguments are definitive, that there is no military approach to this, no quick fix, and neither is there a developmental approach that doesn't challenge the whole nature of what development is and what it's about. But then that leads us to very big challenges indeed, because I would say the only way forward is an integrated global value chain approach, which would have to include the issue of the enrichment of money laundering in Western institutions, offshore banks and Bitcoin. I mean, that's been discussed at many times, the issue of how we would put that into reality. And at the other extreme, of course, we recognise the very, very modest gains of the peasant farmers. And as well, and this made me think quite a bit, as you grow older, you listen to so many debates about development. It's, I mean, you know, we had so many moments when the sort of what is development has been discussed endlessly, but you realise that it's increasingly the way it's being seen is part of the problem, not the solution. So I think part of this resetting of the conversation has to be about what development really means in the world today, right? And the inequalities that are so embedded in the models that have so far been part of it, and how these borderland areas really deserve a different way of being understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and everyone. I'm assuming I can be heard here. I've had a power cut, so I'm now on my phone, unable to see the questions and answers. But let me at least thank our panelists for each of their presentations, and Jenny for your response. Sorry, I'm getting a message here. Yeah. Jonathan, I think you might be able to help me with perhaps feeding some of the questions we've had in the Q&A today. But just to get the discussion going, I've got to notice some of them before I had a power cut. I just want to ask whether the panelists have any quick response to some of the comments of Jenny there, before we go to some of the Q&As that have been listed in the chat. Any quick responses from any of the panelists to the comments of Jenny's?
I mean, I can make a very quick one, which I thought Jenny did a great job of kind of looking at the variation between the cases, but also the key points of convergence. And I mean, just on the Afghanistan case, I mean, I agree. I do think, you know, I take the point that I think that ultimately, even if they're in the informal economy, there's always going to be maybe a little bit of coercion that underpins the functioning of that economy. And I think the main lesson in Afghanistan, it's in the context of an extremely violent context of all kinds of different violence. And in this kind of context, where there's so much insecurity, you know, people are really looking at a survival economy. And so to focus on, you know, a counter-narcotics measure like, you know, these border closures or some of the other quite, you know, the war on drugs type of interventions that have characterized a lot of the Afghan government's engagement in the illicit economy. One is that what we can see over 20 years is that the costs are really felt by, I guess, quote unquote, ordinary people, and not really elites in the Afghan government who have been, and also in the Taliban who have been profiting off this. I mean, so they are able to continue you know, as normal, and it usually is just you know, people who are really using this as a mechanism to survive that are the ones who suffer. So the costs are distributed unequally, and then also the development that comes from, you know, the formalization of the border that flows into the formal border crossings. I mean, again, it's not something that's experienced equally by the population. It's something that tends to be captured by a lot of the elites in the country. And I think we would like to do a little bit more research on this. But I do think if we had, you know, more, if we're able to do more field work, it's interesting to look at the impact on the structures of, for example, organized criminal groups. And so we do have some evidence, at least, you know, from our interviews, that those groups become more vertically integrated. So that seems to be what's happening. And so it would be interesting to see, you know, to what extent that's replicated in other contexts, but also across Afghanistan. So I'll stop there and pass to you.
Thanks, Jasmine. Anyone else with an immediate response to Jenny before we get to some of the questions are coming through for me now. I've got at least two, but any other immediate comments from any other panelists?
Let's go on to the questions, Tim, and then we can always come back if there's time at the end.
Let's start with one I'd noted out earlier before I kind of had my power cut. Eric asks whether it's a question to all panelists, which is why I'm starting with this one actually. There's a question about whether crop growers and workers of development, and this touches with some of the issues presented by all the panelists actually. Let's start with Patrick actually, and then growers or workers might in different ways be orphans of development.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and in the paper in IJDP, I didn't have time to go into it in the talk today, but I try and draw on what Jonathan Rigg talks about around needing to differentiate between forms of vulnerability and forms of precarity. And he talks about forms of vulnerability being long-standing drivers of livelihood insecurity, whether that is decades of armed conflict, economic isolation, limited resources. And then he talks about forms of precarity, which are what I talked about more in the presentation today, I guess, new forms of insecurity that are created by the unequal distributive impacts of development processes, which I think is linking more to what Eric is talking here about whether opium cultivators are often kind of orphans of development processes. And I think the point I tried to get across in the paper is that often poppy farmers are sort of doubly exposed, that they are both grappling with long-standing forms of vulnerability that have never really been addressed, and then new forms of development that sort of embed on top of that often create new forms of insecurity and precarity. So I think it's partly that these are already quite marginalized and vulnerable populations linked to much longer standing forms of poverty and underdevelopment. But then on top of that, the narratives around borderland development and the types of development programs that are then implemented in these areas often have very significant distributive impacts in ways that can increase the insecurity of many kind of poorer populations within these areas, which is what I was trying to get across in this project. And I think this links to some of the other questions in the Q&A chat box around how do you change some of the narratives around drug issues. And I think what is clear in Myanmar is that there's been such a focus on trying to promote rapid levels of economic development and investment in areas that for a long time have been very marginalized, that there's often the assumption that if you bring in forms of development into borderland areas, that will inevitably have a knock-on effect on reducing levels of cultivation, because it will help to bring markets and investment to these areas. Whereas I guess what the paper's trying to show is that those assumptions can't necessarily be taken for granted. But maybe I'll finish there and see if others want to kind of come in on this question.
Francisco, do you want to come in?
Yes, of course, the Colombian case is very specific because the legal agrarian developmental path has been so violent. So Eric's answer or Eric's question has at least three answers. First, specific individuals who were kicked out from the legal sector went to the coca growing sector by the hundreds, probably by the thousands, possibly by the tens of thousands. So a lot of people who were thrown out at gunpoint for one reason or another, it as Jasmine said, be it war or be it or be it simply violent land accumulation, went to the coca sector. And on the other hand, let's say the second level would be the question of access to land and the possibility of creating viable rural markets, particularly labor markets. So in a sense, and the Colombian colleagues that might be attending this, allow me this small blasphemy. In a sense, coca is the illegal coffee. It's a small growers economy with very vigorous markets that allow the eventual access to land. But by the way, Patrick, in Colombia, we have massive evidence that the coca economy allows access to credits, very comfortable access to credit, simply because people who want to buy this coca and then export it, cultivate peasants and give them seeds and soft money to start their cultivation. So of course there's variation between countries, but in the case of the Colombian coca sector, I would go. I would say even that it's a specific path of development that has horrors, as many of you have emphasized. I think that the key issue, Jenny went to the heart of the problem, is the lack of state-led regulation. Illegal group regulation does not replace it. So in this sense, this can be a black box of all kinds of horrors. But on the other hand, it has allowed the existence of something that, as Jonathan said, can be said to be the real alternative development in Colombia. So yes, they are the orphans. Paul Göteborg insists in yet another sense in which they can be the orphans. What he says is, look, failed agrarian reforms push people to the geographically eccentric regions because they were very keen on colonization programs. And this is a thesis that he has made a lot of emphasis. It sounds reasonable. I have become rather unsure about this proposition, but anyways, it's there. So there are three main senses in which you can say that the coca growers are orphans of development: the colonization programs, the lack of opportunities, and the opportunities instead on illegal economies, and third, the violence, which you can find, let's say, like materially represented in the life paths of coca growers.
Tim, because you're having problems seeing all the questions, shall I read out one or two? And
do you mind, Jonathan? I have to say I'm unable to see the questions and talk at the same time because I'm now on my mobile phone.
Okay, so I'll read out. There's one from Sergio, which actually applies to particularly to Francisco. So the areas where you develop the basically Afro-Colombian population concentrated. It doesn't actually completely make sense to me. I'm willing to say that Tumaco region invested more in education than those in Putumayo. Alternative development is at best a name in Colombia since it's not state policy. Okay, did your study focus on cultural values and the state's commitment to alternative development? I guess there's an issue here around whether questions of identity and marginality, how they feed into this, the creation of drug economies and also alternative development programs. So both Francisco and also Pat and Jasmine might have some ideas on this.
Who starts, Jonathan?
You start, Francisco.
Perfect. So look, this is a very important point for me. Of course, there is variation across the country, and I acknowledge that in the article. So one has to be very careful to generalize, but in this case, our survey didn't take place only in Tumaco, but also in Puerto Asís. I have to say that in Tumaco, you have a lot of mestizo peasants, a big sector of mestizo peasants. And besides, we asked for ethnicity, and we compared across different ethnic self-identifications, and we found no difference whatsoever regarding this question. So no, it seems that it's not due to cultural values. Of course, this would deserve a much specific investigation, but I think what many academics and researchers miss, and frankly, it kind of bugs me, is that all these coca growing regions, all these coca agrarian frontiers undergo very vigorous processes of agrarian and social and cultural change. And as actually there is a lot of research here, Maria Clara Torres wrote an exemplary book about this. As people start to transmit and learn from their experiences, there is intergenerational change. So at the beginning, of course, you have a lot of guns and you shoot in the air, and your patterns of consumption are very specific. And then your children start to learn that it's maybe it's better to save, and maybe it's better to invest the money, and let's say a message from the oldies, from the old hands of these economies is, look, our generation simply consumed all this in vain. And we have spoken, this is not only quantitative, but also qualitative, and it's not definitely limited to Afro-Colombians. People have learned from this experience and start to say, we want to invest in education for our children, etc., etc. And this makes a very big contrast with all these discourses of alternative development, among other things, because if one is thinking, and I take very seriously the question of Jenny about what to do, etc. If one is thinking of some viable and humane developmental path, education and savings play a very big role. and you find them here. So my point is not that this is a, let's say, a kind of utopia, etc., etc., or that it's a good solution. It is definitely not. Besides, because if you come across a bad regulator, your life will be a nightmare. But because that there are advantages and gains in this economy that any alternative proposal has to take into account.
So Pat, or Jasmine, do you have anything you'd like to come in on this particular?
I was wondering, actually, I might take up another question by Sergio Uribe as well, which he asked a little bit further down, which he said, is illicit crop cultivation a product of poverty? To what extent is organized crime a driving force behind cultivation? And I think this is something that we explore more in the work more broadly, that there wasn't time to go into the presentation today. But I think in the area that I was presenting on in southwestern Shan State, that alongside all of these agrarian pressures on farmers in the legal economy, obviously this was also facilitated by the fact that opium became a viable alternative crop. And partly that is because of the particular qualities of opium itself. It grows well in upland areas, which were the same kinds of areas where tea was being produced, where thanat pet leaves. So it was a natural alternative. It can also be grown on steep land, it's rain-fed, seeds from one harvest can be kept over for the other. So there are all of these agrarian dimensions in terms of the crop itself, but it was also linked to the fact that very quickly networks of buyers, and it's often also the buyers who are providing rural credit, also connected into these areas and linked them up to larger markets for opium. So that on the one hand, you have a growing demand for heroin, especially from increasing use in China. You have the areas that were more historically known for production that were much closer to China, kind of east of the Salween River, beginning to have opium bans. But you saw a number of these networks linked with organized crime and linked with armed groups who were then moving into these newer areas. So on the one hand, you had these much more grounded pressures from farmers around the difficulties of making a living in the legal economy. And on the other hand, you then had increasing networks of buyers and money lenders linked often to these larger networks who then moved into these regions. And I think what was also interesting about that was that a lot of the farmers talked about how, as they became increasingly integrated into illegal opium networks, also markets expanded for other crops that they were producing, that they talked about how many of the buyers who primarily came for opium were also then buying chilies that they'd only ever really produced for very localized markets, also became increasingly kind of integrated into some of these wider buying networks. So I think there is a part that there's a lot of pressures around poverty that drove this transition from legal cash crops into illegal cash crops. But that was also very much facilitated by some of these wider networks around opium markets, around credit. And this was particularly linked to areas that were under the control of army-backed militias who had carved out sort of informal arrangements with the military in Myanmar. And as a result of that, had a fair degree of autonomy to do what they liked. And that often included involvement in illegal economies. So that, yeah, that was an answer, because there's a lot of questions coming through, but I'll pass back to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, and I can just comment very quickly. And again, yeah, didn't have time to get into, the dimensions of alternative livelihoods in Afghanistan. And the question of raised in these two questions. But I do think there has been a lot of investment in alternative livelihoods in Afghanistan and across Afghanistan. A lot of that has been driven by donors who have been engaged in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. And there have been a lot of, I think at this stage, or at least quite a few evaluations of varying quality. But what you do tend to observe is, that they seem to be effective in terms of, just, passing on particular techniques or learning, which is not necessarily, it's a bad thing on its own. But it hasn't really been effective in terms of, any kind of substantive changes in the level of opium. And instead, what we've seen in the last few years is cultivation levels really reaching all-time highs in many places in the country. And so yeah, I mean, I think that the issue, alternative livelihoods, we do see these programs. There's been a lot of investment as well into education, but I think it's worth noting just the general context again is that one, the levels of poverty are very, very low. Levels of education are very, very low. And I think that donors really just have to take, and international community in general, and the government has to take a very long-term view of how effective alternative livelihood programs could potentially be. And this is really kind of a generational shift. And right now in Afghanistan, people are more insecure than ever. And so it's likely these programs will be more ineffective than ever, because they're just more, people need the kind of security, economic security that you can get from opium. And so I think right now is probably not a time where you're going to see a lot of those programs have their desired effect.
Thanks. There's some very big and very interesting questions here, and I don't think we've got 3 minutes left. So I think a lot of these questions we're going to have to follow up in writing afterwards, because they deserve more serious attention. So I just wonder if there's any kind of concluding thoughts for anyone. I just wanted to make one concluding thought myself in relation to what Jenny was saying, and it's just become much clearer to me in this discussion, which I think has been really useful. When we started out this project, is really about rethinking drugs. And really where we're ending up now is the much bigger question of rethinking developments. And because drugs tell us something quite profound about the nature of development at the current moment and who the winners and losers in these processes are. And borderlands are really concentrations of these kind of inequalities and the unevenness, the exclusion, the violence of development processes. So yeah, it's just, I guess we're opening up a conversation which is not leading us into an obvious kind of set of policy responses, but I think we're moving beyond a very trite, I think, idea that the developmentalisation of drugs is the kind of the answer to our problems. So having said that, I'm probably closing down discussions, but anyone would like to come in on any of the final other questions that they've got before we finish?
Just mention one thing, because I thought Sergio Uribe's question about, am I correct in concluding that we're in a catch-22 situation? Policy should focus not on growers, but organised crime. Yet if effective, this will lead to an increase of poverty in the countryside. The peasant will be worse off than what they were before cocoa poppy. I think that's a really interesting question, but I would just say that I think it's precisely the value of this research is that by understanding, you know, that actually growers gain, you know, from their impoverishment through growing these crops, that any policy has to take that on board. It's got to be better, hasn't it? We know this. This has been a debate for many years, but it feels to me we don't have the policies that are going to really focus on an integrated approach to the value chain, so that whatever happens, you've got to give something to those growers that's going to compensate. Otherwise, there's no point, is it? There's going to be just more and more of the same. So I think that's what we've learned. And if we can't register the learning from the detailed studies you've done, I'm a bit worried.
But also the point on following of that is and what it's obviously it's not just about competing on the a price point with some alternative crop. It's a much bigger package of things. So yeah.
I perhaps just wanted to add a concluding point, which is another sort of tension or trade-off or catch-22 that has come out of the research, which also links to Jean-Luc's question around how we confront issues around harm reduction. That I think one of the other big issues that certainly come out in the Myanmar work is that areas that are traditionally seen in the global south as primarily areas of drug production, of which Myanmar is a classic one, are also increasingly sites of harmful drug use. And this is creating real tensions, both in how you respond to those areas, but also within these areas and communities themselves, that on the one hand, drug cultivation continues to be a really vital coping mechanism for poor populations. And on the other hand, worsening levels of drug harms are also seen as creating new forms of vulnerability and insecurity. And in Myanmar, you've seen these tensions with the Patjasan movement that I briefly mentioned, in that that's not only targeting people who are using drugs, it's also been targeting farmers and been trying to kind of forcibly eradicate opium fields. And then you've got issues where the farmers themselves are trying to arm themselves to protect themselves against these responses. So on the one hand, it makes the point that these kind of drug wars are not something that only originates in the West and is then being exported into these areas. It's also a matter of great concern amongst local communities. And it also raises huge tensions that in the past, I think there's often been an assumption that these kind of activities, such as drug production, are illegal, but are seen as illicit locally because they're part of livelihoods. What you're increasingly seeing in some areas is they are officially illegal. They're also seen as quite illicit amongst local communities, and yet they continue. And I think Jean-Luc's point is very spot on about how do we engage with issues around drug harms in these contexts of ongoing instability, armed conflict, insecurity, where models of best practice around harm reduction, which have often been sort of generated in quite different contexts, do not land very easily in the kind of context that we're now working in. And just a final point, in some of the interviews, like people there are very aware that you're not going to get a solution to drug issues until you solve the bigger issues around the conflict and around peace. But they also know that is going to take generations to come in a place like Myanmar. So it's what do you do in the meantime around trying to ameliorate some of the harms that are created by drug usage in that period. And I don't think we have clear answers to that yet, but I think it's another key entry point that we should be trying to engage with on this project.
So sorry, Jonathan, two points drawing on this. Timing and time horizons are fundamental to think about feasible policies. And I think it's fundamental to develop also a political economy of alternative development. This involves coalitions, etc. Actually, the paucity of evaluations or of serious evaluations in Colombia shows that they want to do this no matter what. And when it really works, it has very mixed effects. So I think that creating and developing and understanding the logic and the coalitions that are needed for the implementation of alternative development is also fundamental. So I think that taking this into account would help to move towards this very difficult translation between the political economy analysis and some policy ideas.
Handing over to Tim now.
Well, apologies for my in and outness. I think in terms of time, we're probably our time is probably up. Unless Jasmine, I think most of the panelists got a chance to say a final word, including in relation to Jenny's points about how we might reset the conversation. Would you like to say and have a final word? If not, I'm going to thank all the panelists as well as all of your Q&A, which I think we're going to keep a hold of so we can respond to further. You also have our email, I guess, if some of you have kind of asked anonymous questions. Apologies for me not being able to see the Q&A or input as I would have liked, but it's been a fantastic conversation to hear. So I'm going to thank everybody. Jonathan, if you want a final word of thanks on behalf of the project, but thank you from me for a great session.
Yeah, it's okay for me. I think I don't have any final comments, but I think there are some interesting questions in the Q&A and we can follow up on just by email, I think would be great. Thanks.
Absolutely.
I would just like to say thank you very much for everybody attending. Thank you for all the presenters. Thanks for Tim for chairing. And thanks in particular to Louise, who's been the one who's organised this event, which I think has been very productive and very, very useful for us as well.